I would like also to introduce you for our guest, Professor Rafael Santos. He's in charge of the graduation of the School of Electrical Engineering. That's our host here. So I asked him to come here to give you a welcome before speech.
Thank you, Jonathan. First of all, I would like to apologize for not being able to be here yesterday for the opening session. And my mission is to welcome you in the name of the director of the School of Electrical and Computer Engineering of Unicamp, and say some words about our school. This is a School of Electrical and Computer Engineering, and we are about 90 faculty members here, and we have 2 undergraduate courses. Most of you know this. A course of electrical engineering with about, in this moment, I have some numbers, about 1,000 undergraduate students in the electrical and in the computer engineering courses. We have also graduate courses, master and doctoral programs with about 290 master students and about 300 doctoral students, so it's a very big program. And this school, the areas of actuation, we are a very diversified areas of actuation. So we work in many areas as different as telecommunication, energy and power systems, electronics, microelectronics and photonics, control theory and automation, computer engineering, and biomedical engineering. So the area of sound engineering is also very important here. We have many people that actuate in digital signal processing and correlated areas. And the school is very proud for having this colloquium here. And we hope that you have a nice 2 weeks here in Brazil. Especially, I'd like to welcome the researchers from IRCAM that are here. And I pass for the next speaker. I think is Jean Breton. Jean Bresson.
Okay, so for variety's sake, I will be presenting our guest, Jean Bresson. Jean did his PhD, I think, at IRCAM a while ago. Has been working there on the development of open music. He will be talking about this software. It's been developed for composition initially, has been also applied to a variety of other fields like music analysis. Today he will be presenting some aspects of this powerful software that is open music. So please welcome Jean Bresson, who will be our guest this morning. Thank you.
Okay, it works. Yeah. So, hello everybody, bon dia. I changed a little bit the program as compared to the topics announced initially in my abstract, because I plan to show some recent projects around computer-aided composition, and one of these projects concerned this an opera of Marco Stroppa that took place 2 years ago, which involved sound synthesis in particular, sound synthesis processes. And then I thought it could be interesting, at the contrary, to focus on this particular work and try to go around and see some different aspects of computer-aided compositions, using this example as a main thread of my presentation. So it's a little bit different, but the same topics will be addressed in between today and the talk of tomorrow. So now it's titled Composing with Sounds, Composing Sounds. So I will try to relate everything to the idea of using sound analysis in composition and using computer-aided composition to deal with sound analysis and sound synthesis. Yesterday, Gerard presented a little bit the general ideas of computer-aided composition and the open music environment. And as he said, it was initially designed to work in what we usually call the symbolic part of music, of musical structures, like typically scores and all the thing you deal when you are composing music. But some recent works have been carried out by myself and before that by other colleagues in the music representation team to try to extend this idea of composing with computer, not only to the field of symbolic music and scores, but also to the field of digital sound processing and sound synthesis, sound transformation, sound analysis, etc. So this working in these aspects involves a number of differences and paradigmatic shift as compared to traditional music composition with computer. In particular, we have to deal with micro and macro levels of the musical and sound representation. We have to deal with some psychoacoustic issues. We are not dealing exactly with the same kind of musical information, and that's also not exactly the same aesthetic targets that we are addressing in this work. So we are going to be focused on the open music environment, so I won't spend too many time presenting it. Maybe some of you already know it, and Gerard explained a little bit yesterday. So that's the idea is that we are in a visual programming environment that composers use to generate, transform, modify, do any kind of algorithmic or programming activity using graphical programming and some specific data container that are usually related to scores or other kind of musical representations. In our case, we will deal a lot with sounds, control curves, and relate this to the traditional musical representation. I will speak of, I will give some examples, as I said, in the Marcos Ropa's recent opera, but I will give some other examples that are extracted from the OM Composers book. It's a book that we published a few years ago. There are 2 volumes, actually, and it contains some experience. Every chapter is written by a composer, and it describes its use or use of the environment for different aspects of his compositional activities. So I will show briefly some examples taken from here and take more time to focus on Stropa's work. So just a quick introduction on Marcos Stropa's opera Riorso. It was premiered in 2012 at the Opéra Comique in Paris. It's an opera for 4 singers, 4 actors, 11 instruments, and voice and invisible sounds. So, as stated in the presentation of the work, the synthetic voice and invisible sounds are all the electronic parts, and they are considered the same as the other performers and actors on the general sketch of the opera. So that means the composer tried to give the electronic parts the role of a character in his story and in the work. So the initial libretto is extracted from an old story from Arrigo Boito, and it's been adapted by Catherine Ayou-Nicola and Giordano Ferrari. So the first aspect of this opera that I wanted to emphasize here concerns the use of sound analysis models, which means trying to extract some data from sounds and use them in the compositional processes. In composition, in general, there are lots of different representations that can be used as compositional data, but we usually tend to use the spectral representation. Composers usually do. So this is a spectrogram of a sound. I guess most of you are more or less familiar with this representation. It's a time versus frequency representation, and the grayscale represents the amplitudes. This view is built by by a sequence of Fourier transform frames that make this global timed representation. But in the musical application, we used to consider these partials that I represent here with the red lines, which abstract the main sinusoidal components from the sound spectrum into some more close to symbolic structures. So the use of this kind of representation is quite commonplace today. It was introduced and developed quite a lot by all the spectral composers, Gérard Griset, Tristan Murail, Claudie Malherbe, and others. In the OM Composers book, there is a text from Claudie Malherbe that is interesting, and that's where I extracted these pictures, which describes the different paths he devised between the sound representation and the score representation and all the symbolic manipulation that can take place between all these representation. So some processes that are described and that are still, there are not that much basic processes that are used, is the idea of segmenting the spectrum into relevant entities, trying to detect the partials, as I showed before with the red lines on the spectrum, and somehow making some averaging of the partials into the different sound segments, which allow to go from a low-level representation, upper, to something that resembles a kind of score. It's a time versus pitch representation, and two conversions to score like this. So all these different scales of representation are as much levels at which a composer can work to transform and use the compositional data. So this process, as I said, have been used and developed quite a lot by composers. In particular, the different tools developed at IRCAM are very much oriented to this kind of manipulation and the transformation of musical material. In the AudioSculpt software, you can do analysis and export the result of this additive representation, or the result of partial tracking. There are different file formats that you can import in OpenMusic and make some different kind of transformation to convert these result of analysis into symbolic score representation. More recently, we have worked in some specific tools. You can see here, for instance, the transient detection or the chord sequence analysis boxes in OpenMusic visual programs that allow you to communicate directly with the sound processing engines that are initially contained in software like AudioSculpt. And within your visual program, within the compositional process, perform the sound analysis processes in order to complete the cycle from sounds to symbolic representation without leaving the environment. So these are a few examples taken from the OM Composers book that use this kind of processes. The piece from Grégoire Lorieux, Langage de l'ombre, uses some sound analysis to create some kind of library of different musical structures that he used after in his composition. There is another interesting example by Permanus Lindborg, who analyzes the sound here. It's the spectrogram of a sound. It's actually a discourse from Mao in China. And we see some kind of gray areas which correspond to the moments where the audience is applauding or shouting or something. So he makes some analysis of this structure and extracts some pitch and temporal patterns that are supposed to mirror the emotional contents the overall discourse. So that's just to give you some examples of the various and different things you can do with this kind of models. So in the rehearsal opera, this process is used at different moments to generate different parts of the music. One is to control the disc clavier. So the disc clavier is an automatic piano. You can control it with MIDI. It's called DSK. That's the disc clavier from IRCAM. It's a joke with Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the politician, because it was at the same time. And so Stropa divides some processes that allow to make this instrument somehow alive, because he wanted to have every character in the opera associated with an instrument that represents his mood somehow. So there is one character. This one is associated with the disc clavier, and the disc clavier follows him on the stage and reacts a little bit like depending on what he says or what he does. So I will just show you a quick example here. We'll see two videos. This is the shooting from the opera, and this is a studio recording session focused on the piano keyboard. So I have tried to synchronize the two, but they are not exactly synchronized. Oh, you have no sound? So I make the oops. The sound Okay, I'm not sure it was very well synchronized, but that's the idea, to have the keyboard reflecting some. So I will show you the Open Music patch corresponding to another section. Maybe we watch the video first. So that's another part where this character, I don't remember his name, but he's laughing, and so the piano will try to be happy and laugh too. So the Open Music patch responsible for this part of the disk clavier is here. You can see it's not that big, but it generates a very complex score. So at the beginning of this process, we start from this. This is an SD file. It's the result typically that is exported with AudioSculpt software after a sound analysis, which extracted the partials in a sound. So all the partials are in these SD files, the frequency and amplitude information. They are stored into some containers. So I'm evaluating everything in real time. So this process is a little bit long because there are lots of data. You will see I will open So in this box is, so we have a few comments from Stropa here. He says this is the raw model of the sound. This is because there are too many time markers in the sound. So that's all the data that's been extracted from every single little gray dot here is a time frequency information. So the first thing the composer does here is to process this sound model with some rounding and filtering rules. So this is all programmed here. I will not get into too much detail, but the result is that the different pitches are rounded to the closest pitch from the keyboard, so just semitones. While here we had the whole frequency precision. So now we either remove or round to the closest pitch, and some of irrelevant information, for instance, if amplitudes are too low or other rules that are just defined here, are taken into account to lower the amount of data. So we see there is a bandpass filter, an approximation of the frequency, and at each moment it keeps only the, I think 100, sorry, the four main partials. So at every single moment you have only, if you make some vertical lines, you will find only 4 at the same time. So this information is still in the kind of spectral area of representation, but it can be converted directly into a score representation. That's what we have here. So that's a first version of the score. I can play it. Okay, so that's not exactly what the piano the piano plays on stage. There is another step of processing here. What this step does is also a kind of simplification, but also of randomization, because if we look here, we see that, for instance, the same frequency tend to happen a lot, especially in the higher frequency areas. So he wanted to randomize these lines at the top in order to make the score a little bit less regular. So that's what we have here. Okay, and then there is a kind of quantization process that makes all this into a rhythmic representation, because even if it was MIDI piano. He wanted to have the score, and the score is stored with the score for the other instruments. So that's what we get if we evaluate this box. So that's the one representation of the score for the disc clavier. So now we can see what's the final result on this video. That's more or less what we just heard on the in the opera. But I would like to let you guess what was the original sound, if you didn't hear it yet. So I knew someone. Come on, don't be shy.
La donna è mobile, qual piuma al vento.
So that's the transcription of this passage from La donna è mobile, sang by the disc clavier.
La donna è mobile, qual piuma al vento, mutata cento e di pensier.
So the idea is not that the original sound being recognizable, but it's take something from it and retranscribe into the score. Now you know it. I'm sure it's much obvious if you hear it again. Okay, I don't play it entire, but I think it's more recognizable. Just for the fun, and I switched to something else. It's not related to these analysis models, but at the end, the character dies, is killed by another one. So you will see how the composer made the disc clavier die too. So he made a kind of gesture on the score, which supposed to give this impression. then it lasts a little bit more. But so here it's a generation of the score plus the MIDI controllers that are responsible for the pedal of the piano. So you know already some part of the story, that the guy dies. I'm sorry. And I will have to tell you a little bit more about the story after. The second stage after this analysis and extraction of models from sound analysis is the bridge to sound synthesis. Because when we have some representation like this, it's quite easy to put them back into a sound synthesis process where each of these partials here, the time frequency curve, are used to control an oscillator and make some additive synthesis that reproduce some sense of the contents of the original sound. It can be additive synthesis, but it also can be any kind of process that someone understands what's a frequency and what's an amplitude. So it's almost any kind of synthesis processes. So it's also quite a common use of this representation in open music to use them for feeding sound synthesis processes. I have this old example from Stropa that exemplify what you can do in this kind of approach of the sound structure. It's in his piece from 97, Come Natura di Foglia, and he used the sound at the beginning. So this time I let you hear the sound right now. Okay, it's a fisherman's song from behind. So these are sonogram analysis of this sound. So you see, it's kind of close to the representation we have now in the open music objects that I showed before. So the sound is analyzed, is segmented into pieces, and in each segment there is an estimation of what are the main frequencies in this segment. That makes a kind of a skeleton of the sound, and these information that correspond to our time versus frequency model of the sound are used to parameterize some different kind of sound synthesis processes. So this is with oscillators. This is the same data with some noise synthesis. So it's a noise and some filtering. Okay, you can use the data not to parameter oscillators, but to parameterize bandpass filters, for instance. This is why with an frequency modulation synthesizer. So then, in the same idea as before, with taking the model of the sound and transforming it in order to make the sound less recognizable and keeping the skeleton, the internal structure of the sound, Stropa made a lot of different experiments that take this structure and transform into some different sounds. So fortunately documented a little bit, so we have some information and some sound extracts. For instance, here he says pan from right to left 10 to 20 subcomponents. So what he calls subcomponent is when you have one time frequency component, it creates a lot of smaller components around this area of time and frequency in order to generate some kind of cluster feeling in the sound. So he says each partial has 10 to 20 subcomponents, sounds more clustery. The spectral amplitude and duration of each partial progressively reversed, which produce a final chord with the higher frequencies being the longest and loudest. Okay, another example, slower tempo, pitch transposition, more clustery, more independent individual partials. Here, very large, I read because it's written smaller. Very large clusters, 20 to 100 subcomponents around each partial. And this one, exponential accelerando and percussive attack, bell-like. So in this example, for instance, you see you can keep the same frequency component and take the time of the different segments and make some processing just on this time information before, for instance, saying scale the first one to be larger and then accelerate. And you get a new structure that can produce this sound. So let's hear a small extract of the piece, of the recording. It's a concert recording, so it's a vocal ensemble and the electronic sound. So if you listen, you will hear most of these sounds I've played independently. They are all composed into the global electronic accompaniment for the voices. Okay, at the end we just heard this one with the accelerando. So I've shown it in the previous example with the disclaviers, but we have these objects that allow us to represent these intermediate data between symbolic and spectrum in the open music visual programs. So back in the rehearsal opera, we can also find some examples of this kind of process. In particular, there are different examples of bell sound synthesis. So that's also kind of a similar process. We start from this sound. That's the Westminster Bell in London. An analysis of this sound gives us this kind of simplified representation. So we have different segments that have been, I don't remember, either extracted automatically in AudioSculpt, or it can be set by the composer prior to analysis. So we have this time versus frequency information. And then different kind of processing transform this representation into, for instance, something like this. So this is a set of spectra that overlap each other because the time segmentation has been modified here in the intervals. It's a visual program that generates the interval. And the frequency content is taken from here, exactly the contents of the 6 first regions in this one. Then there is a process that transforms this representation into the control data for a sound synthesis process. So this conversion is controlled in this visual program here. So I'm not getting into too much detail either, but the idea is to scale the frequencies between the lowest frequency of each segment and the maximum frequency of the overall sound. So that makes quite a transformation in the frequency content. The durations are also transformed here with this BPF that is entered as a parameter, and this is an amplitude profile for the different partials of the sound. So all this is used to control additive synthesis process. Every single data will become an oscillator controlled in frequency, duration, amplitude, envelope, etc. And we generate new kind of bell sounds that are not exactly the same as the original one, but take some of its structure and are used and take some of the compositional input from all this process. So in here, I just took the 6 first segments in here, in this structure, in order to accelerate the process. And we will generate a sound made of 6 other sounds from here. So the synthesis for the technical information is performed by C-Sound. So what OpenMusic does is it just writes C-Sound files for the score and the orchestra, and then it makes a call to the C-Sound program that is installed separately on your system, like we do for SuperVP or PM2 in the analysis processes I've shown before. So that's our result sound. Okay, so I've been through these different segments that have been defined here. For each one, a different scaling of the frequency contents, and this amplitude envelope that gives a new kind of bell profile for the sound. In this patch, it's quite a similar example, but I have added this. It's part of Stropa's experimentation, but he never kept this for the final version, where also slight delays are applied to each individual component in the different segments. So that will make quite different result. And the delays are growing over and over in the sound. Okay, so that shows that you can use the same initial structure and go to a very wide universe of possibilities depending on the different transformation and the choice you make in between this analysis and the synthesis process. So back in the opera, we can see the actual extract where we hear this sound. So I simplified a little bit the patch here because it's much longer. And even on the video here, I have cut and pasted in order to make it a little bit shorter. Okay, so that's different parts where these bell sounds appear. You see at the beginning they are quite different, a little bit like I did before, and at the end they look very much like the original sound. So you may have picked another information at the same time. All other characters are also dead at this moment. So now this one is the last one. Well, I'll tell you more about the story after. The previous part from the Commennatura di Foglia piece from Stropa also showed an interesting aspect, is the link between the sound analysis and resynthesis with the score. If you hear what the singers were singing, it's quite close to the synthetic sound we use. So that's another thing that Stropa takes much care about in his work. Trajectoria is one of his first electronic pieces from '92, and he didn't use open music at that time, but he already had this kind of concern that are quite obvious in this piece, and in particular I would like to should have made it before, but here the extract where, so the piece starts with piano solo and progressively switch to electronic piece. And the moment where the switch from the piano and the electronic is quite subtle, and you see that the electronics is generated from the piano, and the piano part also takes care of being a sweet transition to the electronics. Okay, same tools, another composer. That's back also again in the OM Composers book. It's a piece by a former Cursus student at IRCAM, Tolga Tuzu, which also emphasizes this relation between the sound analysis to synthesis approach and the relation to the score. So the process begins with a sketch drawn by the composer that is played by a bass player who actually plays two basses at the same time. This is the analysis of the resulting sound. Then the analysis data is used and processed in Open Music to generate some symbolic score parts that are used, and also some rhythmic cells using different processes of the analysis data. And this data is at the same time used to regenerate the score for the player and the synthetic parts of the tape. And then the piece is played by the bass player again and the electronics. So I have short extracts here of this of the piece. Okay, so that concludes the first part. And yep. The other part in this work with Tropa that engaged lots of research and developments was the synthesis of voice sounds, which have been done with using the chant synthesizer. So I will make maybe a technical introduction of this synthesis technique and then show you also some examples of the compositional process in the piece. So the chant synthesizer uses the FOF fonction d'onde formantique or formant wave function technique. It's been developed by Xavier Audet and his team back in the 80s at IRCAM. So it was quite an interesting technique because it allowed to generate powerful and realistic voice sound with very low cost of computation. The idea is to use these formant wave functions. They look like this. It's kind of a sinusoid plus specific shaped envelope. And when you generate trains of impulses of this little sound, like kind of a synchronous granular synthesis, you obtain this kind of shape in the sound spectrum, which correspond to, in the vocal sound analysis, a formant. Formant is if you look at the voice sound, you will see some kind of big shape like this, which characterize the voices of the speaker, and the vowel is saying like A, O, U. So this is determined by this general shape. And so they discovered that by precisely tuning the parameter of this simple waveform here, in particular the slope and the different parameters that determines the shape, you can also determine the shape of the formant over there. So you can determine its central frequency, is bandwidth, is amplitude, etc. So the idea of the FOF synthesizer is to use several of such generators in parallel with the same fundamental frequency, the impulse of the trains. So the fundamental frequency makes and the different FOF that you would have in parallel would generate the different formants that characterize the voice sounds. So in here, sorry, sounds. This simple process with one formant, one single train of impulse, would give a sound like this one. So that's supposed to be kind of a O. And if you put 5 such generators in parallel with different parameters so that you get these 5 bumps in the spectrum, you get a richer sound that gets closer to the voice sound. Still sounds a little bit electronic, but then the fine-tuning of the parameters fix it. Then all the process of using this synthesizer is to precisely, as I said, tuning this frequency, amplitude, bandwidth, shape of the grains in order to make some realistic or non-realistic voice sounds. So an interest in the chant synthesizer in particular is that it allows you to set this value of parameters at different points in time, and then it generates interpolation between the values automatically. So for instance, I have made some quick sounds. Okay, in this example, I just gave 2 values for the fundamental frequency, one at the beginning, one at the end, and the synthesizer makes it. So this is also practical when we will try to make some voice effects like tremolo, vibrato, or transition like singing, because you don't have to shape everything, but the synthesizer does a lot of the work for you. A more strange example. Okay, you can do any kind of variation of the parameters, and the synthesizer makes it for you. So this is a little bit of history on this project. Maybe I don't detail too much, but there have been different environments before that have been used to control the synthesizer, but since the 90s, the last one was dephone environment. It allowed to combine phonemes to regenerate kind of a concatenative synthesis method, and since then there has been no more work on the synthesizer. So what we did is just to take the synthesis kernel of this environment and try to control it from open music. Okay, other implementation have been done meanwhile in Max or in C Sound, but they don't provide these automatic interpolation features that the original chant kernel had. So in open music, our problem is quite simple. It's just to set these parameter values for different points in time. So we have a virtual timeline like this. A different kind of patch of synthesis that gives us a number of parameters, and we set the parameters of the value of these parameters at several points in time, and then provide this to the synthesizer. In the 80s, the analysis synthesis team wrote a manual for chant, which has been very useful in this work because it contained a lot of information on how to generate realistic voice sounds. For instance, there is a database of values for the different formants that correspond to the A, E, O, E, for different kind of singers, alto, soprano, etc. It gives some rules like this that ensure that the sound is also correspond to real voices. For instance, this is a relation between the frequency and the bandwidth of the formant. You see if you make some analysis that this follows this kind of shape. The higher the frequency and the higher the bandwidth of the formant. Or this one is also very useful. It's a relation between the fundamental frequency and the frequency of the formant. For instance, if you have a sound like O, you have the first formant at a given position in the spectrum. And if you do O, the formant also shifts with the fundamental frequency. It doesn't shift exactly the same, and it depends on the different vowels, etc. So we had this information that was useful also to generate some control rules for the synthesizer. So with all this information and some control data that can be extracted from any, generated from any process, we generate a file. It happens to be at the SD format, the same format that was used for the sound analysis and audio sculpt. And this SD file is provided to Chant for parameterizing the synthesis. So that's the technical aspect. It's not very interesting, but you see that that's the scheme of an example file. That it's not like an audio file where you have to sample all the control data. You can just choose to put some control information at different points in time, and the synthesizer will make all the continuous variation for you. I will switch to more interactive examples here. For instance, this one. This one is a OM Chant synthesis patch. So what it does is this function gives me one of these values, A, E, I, O, U, randomly. And this is alto, bass, contre-tenor, soprano, tenor. So every time I evaluate this, I get a different combination of singer and vowel. And then I will use this to produce some information for the fourth control data that look like this. It's kind of an array of parameters. And this is a curve for the fundamental frequency of the overall process. So you generate these two main information, fundamental frequency values for the fourth generators. And then you connect this to the synthesized box here. I reinitialize so you see it's real. Yep. And I get this sound. Okay, so in this case, every time I evaluate, I will get the same frequency, but different vowels. This example is quite similar. I don't choose anything in random, but I choose an alto O. And first I will remove this and the fundamental frequency curve. Okay, you see it follows it. I can change, oops, no. Keep it connected. See if I say alto E. Okay, and if I make some change in here, I will change the fundamental frequency, for instance, up. Okay, then there is a lot of tools, as I said, that allows us to make some more realistic voice sound, and in particular the vibrato for singing voice is very important. So this is a vibrato generator, that's the frequency profile of the vibrato. It goes from 4 Hz to 5.5, then 6, then 4, so it kind of accelerates and decrease. And that's an amplitude factor that is applied to the original curve. Oops. Maybe I should not make this more. Yes. Okay, so that's useful. Then you can tune it a little bit more. You can also use some jitter effect that allow you to make this kind of vibrato, but less regular, to make it more realistic too. Oops. You can also generate some voice, some sound that does not look like voice. If you make some, here we used at the origin some voice parameter, and we transform them so that they don't look at voice anymore. I show it because you will see in the opera this process is also frequent. So in this kind of sound, we feel like there is some voice somewhere, but it's not anymore some realistic voice sound. This is another example. And in the opera itself, we used a lot of this kind of processes that started with standard simple voice sound as the one I made at the beginning, and transformed them. For instance, this is a voice generating patch. Yep. So you see the parameters are a little bit more complex and subtle. The vibrato has this profile. So it's accelerating, then slowing down as I did before. But in addition, there is a jitter here that changes the amplitude of the vibrato across the duration of the process. And this same patch, as you see here, the green arrows are inputs of this patch, is used again and again with different parameters to generate a lot of such short voice sound. I have a number of them here. So in this patch, I use the other one. I open it, it's called One Voice, and this one is Voices. And these are the set of parameters I used iteratively on this patch to generate a whole list of different sounds. So I will run this big patch here, and it should generate 1 to 9 different sounds with the same original patch and different parameters. Okay, so let's hear them. This is the first set of parameters. So you see the sounds are getting more and more electronic like. And even at the end, when the pitch is getting very low, the pitch is getting low, and the bandwidths also are supposed to be narrow enough to make the sounds sound a little bit like little bells. Okay, so all these sounds is the same process with different set of parameters. So there is a passage in the opera where they appear, almost exactly the same as these ones. Here. So I can tell you a bit more. So the idea is the main character of the opera is the king, is the one who was walking alone at the end. And the synthetic voice corresponds to the conscience of the king. So he's a bad king, he's very bad with people, he's hurting a lot and killing a lot of his people. So he has bad conscience, and the voices he hears is his conscience that tells him he's going to die and he's done very bad things in his life. And this passage is the first time when he first hears the voice. So you will see he's around, and then the synthetic voice appear, and everyone is listening to them. Okay. So after this idea of generating some short extracts of voices, comes the problem of how you articulate and organize such different sounds into more larger scale phrases, because one of the interests when you do some voice synthesis or similar synthesis processes is how you organize a longer phrase with articulations and transitions. So the structure we use for it that we have seen in the previous patches, and we usually use them also for other kind of synthesis process, look like this one at the right is a kind of a matrix that represents the values of a number of parameters for a number of synthesis components. Previously with the additive synthesis, the components were the oscillators. In this case, it's the different fourth generators for the different formants in the sound. So in the different patches of the OM Champ library, we have these different kinds of events that represent the fourth. That's the one we use. The fundamental frequency, we also use them. And there exists some other that do some filtering, noise generating, or additional sound file input. And every of these objects can be used just as a synthesis controller, as I did before, but also as a kind of independent object that can be articulated with other objects, which means it has a time position in a supposed overall time referential, and also a given duration that allow you, for instance, to use different objects together in these examples, or to set them in the time referential of a maquette. If you remember Gerard's presentation yesterday, it's kind of an interface where you can put objects in time in order to make some temporal structures. let me show you another example. So we have used these events already when I in the different processes I've shown, but in this example here, all this folder is the tutorial examples that are provided with the library. So if you want to play with them, you see there are a lot of them. In this one, we have resynthesized the Queen of the Night from Mozart. So it was an historical example that Xavier Audet and his team did back in the 80s, but they programmed it directly with in their environment at that time. And here we reproduce the same example starting from the MIDI. Okay, that's the MIDI song. And we process this in a loop, in an iteration, and with each of these notes, we generate two different events, like this would correspond to one of the different voices of my previous example. So here we do this iteratively, and we make a fundamental frequency event and a fourth bank of generators event. And we collect everything. If I evaluate this loop here, you see the result. I get a big list with lots of events, and I just give this big list of events to my synthesis function here. I will play it with the piano accompaniment. If it won. The sound doesn't show. D. Okay, I don't have MIDI here. No. Okay, so no piano. Okay, sorry, I'll fix it after and make you hear with the accompaniment. So you got the idea is you take every single note here, and you make a set of synthesis events for the sound synthesis. In the rehearsal opera, also some such sequences are used. There is one funny example at the very beginning of the opera, where some cell phone sounds are generated. Okay, so this is an imitation of a cell phone, but it's done like exactly as if we did with specific frequencies and values for the formants. And then this same process is iterated, and values are changed to this synthetic setup to get more and more close to the parameters of voice sounds. Okay. And we can also morph progressively from one to the other. Okay. Here we just make kind of a similar loop, but at the beginning we keep the strict values, and at the end we increase the vibrato, etc. Or we can even make sounds. Okay, with the sound. So the extract in the I lost. Where is it? Oop, it's here. True. So here again, you will hear the same passage. It's the very beginning when so someone says, "Please shut down your cell phone," and then it starts, and that's the beginning of the opera. So these are the sounds already from the opening.
Mesdames, Messieurs, nous vous prions d'éteindre vos téléphones portables. Nous vous rappelons que les photos avec ou sans flash et les enregistrements sonores ou vidéo sont interdits. Mesdames et Messieurs, nous vous prions d'éteindre complètement vos téléphones portables. Ministres et bons hommes, bourgeois sous ces bourgeois, si au fond de vos lits les cauchemars pour noirs, si en songe vous assaillez de sous-conditions, squelettes et des ombres, de spectres et démons, ravités et dans les jambes, et ces bouches obscures,
Okay, so far we've been through the generating a single sound, then we generate sequences of sounds, but we didn't address the issue of how if you have several sounds overlapping or at the same time. And this is very important, especially if you, well, when you have a temporal structure like a maquette I've shown here, for instance. Okay, you don't want to be constrained with having things in sequence, and you want to organize things like this with parallel construction or overlapping structure. The problem is, as I explained how the system works before, that you imagine you have these events that would be the objects we have in open music, this kind of matrices with the beginning time and ending time. And these are the control values we give to the synthesizer. So in the example I've shown, so far we are in this case here where we set two values that makes a steady sound. Between the two, the synthesizer makes an interpolation and then it plays the next note, okay, in the melodies or whatever. If we have some continuous control for the vibrato or whatever, it's also working because we have a continuous control here, then an interpolation, and then another continuous control. There is a trick we use to make, like in the Queen of the Night example, is when we have a gap here and we don't want to hear the interpolation, we shut down the amplitudes, we make this kind of fade in, fade out on the amplitude values. So instead of giving two values here, we would give four. One with amplitude 0, one is amplitude, amplitude, amplitude 0, and that makes kind of staccato sounds. Problem is if we are in this configuration with overlapping, here we have a kind of a strange transition. We go from the first values to the second one, then back to the first, then back to the second one. So that's can be interesting, but not necessarily what we want. And if we are in this case and we overlap the two, then we get a kind of a mess of parameters in the overlapping area. So this, okay, that's for instance an example. If I have this core and I do kind of the similar process as before, if I look what is the resulting curve from, this is supposed to be the fundamental frequency of each note with the vibrato. If I look the resulting control curve for the process, I have these areas here where all the parameters are messed together. That's a zoom on this view. If I need to close. here, for instance. Okay, that's where it is. Because when I do this, also this is quite similar to the Queen of the Night example. Okay, that's a random melody. Here I generate all the control events as before, and I can synthesize, or I can just write the SDIF control file just to check what are the parameters. Okay, so that's my, oops, that's the previous result. Okay, that's my fundamental frequency curve, and that's the other one. If we here, okay, the overlapping intervals there is all the contradictory values for the fundamental frequency. In this example here, we have a process here. I will explain what it does right after. That allows us to take every two successive events and make some transformation on it. So in this case, I modify the amplitude so that to create this fade in, fade out on each period, and I can get, oops. Okay, here I didn't solve the problem, but just I shut down the synthesizer when it's problematic. So if when we published this paper at a farm workshop at the ICFP conference last year, and we did not agree with the reviewers of the paper because they say, oh, but your problem is very simple, it's just an over-specification of your function or something like this. And we, and especially Marco, he said, no, that's not a problem I want to solve, that's an opportunity I want to grasp to control the transition, what's going on in between two events in my synthesis process. So that's why we developed this process I just did with the fade in, fade out, and say, okay, we will say that we consider this function, this sequence of events, and a function, another function that I say a function, it's a program in OpenMusic that we will devise and determine in order to deal with the problem of two events overlapping. And then we find a solution to apply it to the whole sequence. So one possibility, for instance, is you have two different events like this, and you say, okay, I remove the part in between in order to get this. So it can be done just by interverting the ending and beginning date of the first and the second events. It's quite easy to program. A second solution is to say, okay, I do the same, but in between I want to add some information. For instance, I don't want a silence, or I don't want a simple interpolation. I want to control the vibrato or the other parameters in the transition. So I have two events at the beginning, and my result is two other events plus an intermediate event. That's another strategy. And another strategy could be to take two events and to generate one, which is a kind of a merge of the two first events. That can be done also in OpenMusic with functions that we have for cross-fading curves or other process that can be programmed. So formally, we start from, we have this function that from two events generates a number of other events, 2 or 3 or 1 or 5 or whatever. And if you apply to a sequence, we take a sequence of event and this function, and we generate a new sequence of event by applying it iteratively on two successive events. Okay, so that's how it works. Supposing we use this first strategy, we have these 4 events, and we take the first 2, we generate 2, we take the last one of this plus the next one here, we generate 2 more, we take the last one of this plus the next one here, and we generate 2 more, and at the end we have the 4 events with no overlapping. So this is how it looks. Maybe I have the sounds already. Sound overlap. No, it's not here. Okay, so that's the result of this process. What happened here, it's not very nice because as we have shrinked the values of the things, we change the frequency of the vibrato. And so we hear that the vibrato is not very nice. So in the second case, if we take 2 and we generate an intermediate event, that makes this. I take the first 2, I generate 3, I take the last one here, and the next one, I generate 3 more. I take the last one and the next one, and I generate 3 more, and at the end I get this kind of sequence here. So the result look like this. Here, okay, if I suppose the process is this one, we say I start from one value and finish another one, and I generate a kind of vibrato. I can produce some more better looking curve, but you see there are a lot of discontinuities because I do not control the point where the event, I don't finish and the next one starts. However, this case was interesting. We had an internship with Raphaël Foulon last year, an ATIAM student. And he focused his work on this intermediate event, saying, okay, what can we do to make some better processing for generating this event? And in particular, he was interested in saying, what if we use this intermediate event to simulate the consonants like M, L, N, etc. So he made some analysis of sounds, observed how was the spectrum behaving, and produced develop this kind of structure. They also look like control matrices, but they determine the shape of the transition for each different parameter of the fourth generator, amplitude, frequency, amplitude, etc. And for the 5, if there is 5 different formants that we are using. So this, for instance, is a profile of a B. The frequencies does like this. We suppose this is the ending value of the previous note, and this is the next value, the beginning value of the next note, etc. So that's the profile for B, that's the profile for M. We can look at the sound. So it's not very, very realistic, but we recognize the... So that's with the B profile and the M profile. Okay, so the results are not yet very realistic, but it's interesting to, that corresponds to this idea of grasping the moment where there is this transition and trying to control it. Probably by doing some more precise work on these parameters, we could get some better results. And finally, this last possibility is the one that gives the better result, even if it's much more costly in computation, because we must imagine there are lots of such events and lots of data in each event, and we get some growing data structures. So with the first 2, we make a bigger one, and with this big one and the next one, we make a bigger one, and we make a bigger one, and at the end, we finish with one very big control event that merges all the other events. So we program this with the crossfade functions, and we get this kind of fundamental frequency profile. And here, I just show the fundamental frequency, but you must imagine we do the same with the other parameters of synthesis. And the result is... Okay, so this one was by far the better sounding result. I finish with this last example, and I I give you the end of the story. So this is the king, and is dying too at the end. And the process of his dying uses this idea of a big sequence of events, not to generate a phrase like this, but it's because the composer Marco wanted to generate a very big sound. It lasts several minutes, and this sound is actually a process that goes through several stages that are recognized, that he recognized in the process. So for this, he used different kind of structure within. For instance, this is our somehow pitch versus time representation of the sound analysis model. But in this case, it's not extracted from analysis; it's generated from scratch. The idea is to make a sound that starts from the voice of the character on stage, of the singer. So these are the values of the first 4 months of his voice. Should be 5. I don't know where. And progressively in the process, these 4 months will converge to a more complex spectra, which correspond to the spectrum of the bell from the beginning, the additive synthesis process. And so here we have just 5. Here we have several hundreds. So each formant is actually a cluster of formant that spread more and more while the process is progressing. So we have this spreading of the frequencies. At the same time, there is a curve of fundamental frequency that decreases. So the voice starts like and then and at the end it's so loud that it becomes and at the same time the bandwidth of the formants is also decreasing. So we have some kind of a additive synthesis that is simulated here at this point with the fourth generators. So we go from the sound, the synthesis of a voice with the fourth technique, and we arrive progressively to an additive synthesis that simulates the bell that we heard at the beginning. And all this is controlled by a number of stages that are defined with steps. You see, for instance, at the top, it's the fundamental frequencies. I have the real patch here. Yes, I'm making. Here are the fundamental frequencies. Here are the different steps of the frequency, and this is the bandwidth. So it's a small number of different stages, and everything is controlled by this transition process that I described before. So it's a little bit messy, but that makes the work of crossfading the fundamental frequency in particular, and that synthesizes the sound. So I will finish by last video example of this scene of the opera. Video.
Thank you. Hello? Hello? Hello?
Hello? Hello? Thank you very much, John. It was very nice because you give incredible examples. So I guess we have a lot of questions. So who's going to be the first one? And also we have questions from the internet. Tatiana, maybe you can come here and ask some of the questions. Okay?
So we have two persons that asked. The first one is André Luis Gonçalves. He wants to congratulate your work with sound synthesis, which he says results into extremely beautiful sonorities. He would like to ask you two questions. The first is, do you know if this kind of signal process based on the spectral analysis is applied in current installations or sound interventions or other kind of artistic expressions outside the concert hall music? The second one is, concerning the voice synthesis, are you familiar to spectrum analysis? And if so, for what reason did you opt for not using this kind of analysis on your work?
Okay, for the first question, personally I don't know of other application outside contemporary music composition, but it's possible, I don't know, sorry. And the second one, the spectrum analysis, as far as I know, is kind of a spectral analysis of the spectra, and it gives some coefficient that look like these spectral envelope which represent the formants, but as far as I know, it's more used for analysis than synthesis. I don't know about synthesis techniques that use it, but maybe, I don't know. And we use the FOF synthesizer just because we decided to use this tool, the chant synthesizer, and that's the technique it was implemented in it.
The second one, he is called Guilherme Lunyami, and he wants to ask you if the transitions between the sounds is based on the sampling theory of electronic music. And he says that the theory comes from Miller-Puckett from PG. And he explains it's thought as periodic windows with a repetition frequencies that when accelerated leads towards another kinds of materials.
So this is probably the internal chant synthesizers work to do this transition, because we just, as I said, our control part consists in setting the values at specific points in time that we're interested in, and then we rely on this synthesizer for doing the interpolation. As far as I know, it works much simpler than this, is because we have these FOV generators here, and internally it's sampled at a given control rate that we specify at the beginning. And when we give one value for the beginning, one value for the end, it just computes the whole intermediate values, and these are used to control the variation of this shape of the grains or the fundamental frequency or whatever. It's not about, I don't think it's about overlapping but also that's more a DSP question that I use external tools not to have to consider myself.
Por favor, quem quer fazer mais alguma pergunta? Aqui? Ok.
I have. Huh? So I have a question actually about the practical aspects of the opera as a production. Yeah? So how long does it take, the whole thing? How long does it last? Yeah.
The opera?
The opera.
I think it's 1 hour, between 1 and 1.5. I don't remember exactly.
And the time of preparation of the whole opera. So how long? Was it like a month or 2 weeks?
2 years?
Oh, no, I mean, after it was composed,
Uh-huh.
how long did the production take?
I think it's been produced and composed a little bit at everything at the same time.
At the same time? Mhm.
Yes. Also, it probably depends on how every composer works. But for instance, Tropa is kind of a perfectionist, and he keeps working the score and the electronics until the last day. So, so the musicians are not always happy to be given last minute the scores and everything. So he had some constraint, like giving the score 2 months in advance, or I don't know exactly how long. And for the electronics, it's been worked out until the last day, I would say. So it's not exactly a time of composition and time of production. It's been all prepared.
But for example, I'm just thinking about me. So the conductor got a score how long before? So she was the musicians and
I don't
those
know.
other things.
I would say like maybe 3 months, or
3 months, okay.
but not sure.
Uh-huh. And so you said how many singers there were?
Four. Four singers, and there are
And
8 characters in total, but 4 are not singers.
Okay. And the composer wrote the text and the music, or?
No, the text is inspired by an old story, and it's been rewrote by I don't remember their name. Okay, 2 writers, and it's been all set up and modified, also with the director of stage, and so it's been really a collaborative work, as far as I know. I've been most involved in the studio part when we were preparing the sounds and everything, but I was not really in the production of the...
Okay, because the telephone part, for example, this was composed later on, right? Or it was not part of the plot beforehand.
It's been planned quite long in advance, but he was saying, okay, I will do this at the beginning, but this was not really a problem because it did not involve any of the musicians, or it's just to say.
One question. So I have a question, Jean. I think you showed us a very interesting correlation or relationship between symbolic notation and audio. So, and we know that open music is very well known for work with symbolic notation. And I think what you try to show us today is how can we bridge from symbolic to audio and from audio to symbolic. I think it's very interesting the way you approach and you show us a plot, opera. But my question is more about your work. So that means, so we have been working with a composer. So, but part of the composer's ideas comes from the way it's possible to work with open music. I think it's like a laboratory. So it's an ongoing research, and you have to listen to the others and the composer listen and transfer the idea of the composer in programming language. I think it's very difficult. I think it's a very tricky task. So I would like you to share with us this challenge, because I know that's not easy. And for us, it's a good example because we can work in laboratory between using program language and use also creative ideas. I think for everybody here is the challenge of our work. So if you can, there's not a imposition, but I would like if you can, let's say, share with us how it works, how it's for you to program, to talk to the composer and come to the program language and so on.
Actually, it's a little bit. All these ideas are a little bit blurred in reality, for different reasons. First, because open music is a software that I program, and it's also a programming language for the users, for the composers. So when the composer uses it himself, is programming. When I'm working with a composer, he's programming. And the role you are pointing is most, at IRCAM, it corresponds to what the RIM do, the computer music designers that are assigned to work with composers during a production. In this case, it was a little bit special because I did work directly with the composer. Also because Tropa is kind of a specific kind of user who is himself quite involved in development and is an expert, is very expert about the low-level technological aspects. So in this case, we develop the tools at the same time of the musical project. And usually it's more, we provide some tools and then we propose this to composers, and the composer work on these tools with some help of a musical assistant, and there is a feedback loop, and we improve the tools, and so it's a lot of players game. In this case, it was more like we had pretty much nothing, and but Marco had clear ideas, more or less, of what he was aiming at, and we did the work of developing the low-level aspects of controlling sound synthesis, the things I showed about the transition, etc. At the same time as his idea were being developed for the piece. So that in this case was kind of a specific situation. In general, I have much less interaction directly with the composer in a specific project, if you know what I mean, as a researcher in the team. But the people that work in the studio with composers most of the time, which is not, I'm not working that much with composers in the studio at the end. But these people who do that, they have much more to deal with this.
Let me ask you this question, because I take a great deal of value when people it's open to listen to compose and try to adjust ideas by talking, discussion. I think it's the greatest aim of this area. So bring a creative process with technology, but in a way that there's a dialogue. Because of that, I enjoy your talk. And I think it's a good way of making research in this area. Combine creative process and technology in a project. So that at the end, we see something. We see a plot, we see composition, and so on.
What I mean is, with Tropa is specific because he needs me just to make the technical aspects, but he's skilled enough to, when he has his musical ideas, he can, he's, how do you say, independent, he's autonomous with the computer and with open music and with everything to be able to manage by himself for what concerns how to implement musical ideas. But sometimes he's locked because say this I cannot do, and usually he's right when he says I can't. It's because it's not possible, and then I can try to provide ways to improve the tools and make this possible.
Mais alguma pergunta? Some other questions? Okay.
Hi. Hello. Concerning your example of the disclavier and the male singer, I would like to know what are the strategies for mapping data from the gestures or the position of the singer, and how does it interfere in real time in that model of notes that you presented us?
There is no real time. Oh. It's the piano part is stored as a kind of a MIDI file, and when the piano enters, or there are some kind of real time, but very low, for instance. But the whole section we've seen is just one sequence that is triggered at the beginning, and then it runs. So then the singer on stage follows. Everything follows everything, but it's every note is not. Actually, at the beginning, he wanted to trigger everything in real time, every note, but there are so many notes, it was much too complicated, and at the end, it was not so accurate, and it was better to have this all fixed in advance.
Yes. Continuing the question, I really liked. I don't know much further of the open music. I'm starting to learn it now. I'm more used to work with pure data and Max, and I was really I really want to know in the opera how do you work to synchronize to make the things work together. There was someone controlling. There are some triggers
open music is designed not to be run during the opera, so it's more a desktop tool in the studio for preparing. So the result of all the open music process you've seen is a huge set of sound files, MIDI files, scores, and then this material is processed in other software to generate the score for the musicians, in a Pro Tools session to make the things, or in a Max patch for being triggered in real time. So the job of open music somehow ends before the concert. Okay, then it doesn't work. That will be part of my presentation of tomorrow. The new work, we are trying to make this a little bit less separate. But initially the idea is this. Open music, you generate offline material, then you get everything in your bag and you go in real-time environment to use them. Or
it works like platform to make the file, the sound file.
Yes. And
later then to
Yes, in this case, yes. But everyone use it differently. But it's not open music that plays the file during the concert. The file is separate.
Thank you.
There is in this open music book, there is a chapter that I like of a composer. He explained everything that he does. It's about adjusting complex data to playing constraints of instruments. So he developed a library, so he generates scores. And he says, at the end of the chapter, he says, okay, at this point, I close the computer and I write everything with a pen and paper. Because it's just an environment to experiment and try to find out what he's aiming at. And when he found what's his real problem, he prefers doing it by hand, for instance. So in this case, you use it for generating nothing, just to
organize
your mind. But that's an extreme case.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry. So I would like to thank you, Jean, very much. Thank you very much for this talk. Nice talk. We discuss technology and music and the creative process. And I'm very glad to have you here and somebody there at the internet. So thank you very much. Thank you, Jean.
Thank you.